It was February 13th in Dresden, Germany. It was a regular day for the people of the city. People went to school and work in the city filled with culture and history. Refugees from the war arrived at the city being at ease knowing that there's no way anyone would bomb a city with nearly no military significance at all. What they did not know was that night 800 bombers filled with high explosive and incendiary bombs would descend on the city in what came to be known as the Dresden Firestorm, one of the most controversial actions committed by the Allies. Dresden is a city in eastern Germany. At the time of World War II, it was Germany's 7th largest city, and as of now is Germany's 3rd largest city. The word Dresden originates from the word Dresdens, which means forest dwellers of the plain. Dresden was founded in 1216 by Margrave Dietrich of Meissen. Dresden was a small German colony, which later turned into a small town. Dresden's ownership has been passed around a lot from Margrave Henry the Illustration to the King of Bohemia, and many others. When Saxony divided in 1485, it became the capital of the resistance by the Albertan line of Wettin rulers. Dresden was later under the control of the rulers of Saxony. Interestingly enough, Dresden had been burned down more than once. In 1491, Dresden experienced a fire that completely destroyed the city. Dresden was later rebuilt in a new Renaissance style. Later in 1539, the city of Dresden accepted the Protestant Reform, a religious movement that swept through all of Europe in the 1500s. From 1757 to 1763, 2/3 of the city were destroyed in the 7-Year War. Later in the late 17th and 18th century, the electors of the city, Augustus I and Augustus II, decided to modernize the city's architecture in the Baroque and Rococo styles of architecture. In 1813, Napoleon used the city of Dresden as a center of operation and won his last battle there. As Dresden left its war era, it started to become a very prosperous city in the 19th century. After the completion of a railway that connected from Berlin and Leipzig, Dresden began to prosper. Dresden soon became known as the Florence on the Elbe, known for its beautiful architecture, fine arts, music, literature, theater, and politics. The Zwinger Museum and Palace and the Frankenkirch Cathedral were world-famous buildings that were in Dresden. Dresden had many famous collections of art and was quite proud of it. Dresden was compared to cities such as Paris before World War II, but its beauty would not last forever. In 1939, the Second World War had broken out in Europe. The two sides of the war were the Axis powers and the Allied powers. The Axis powers were the German, Italian, and Japanese as the 3 principal partners. The major Allied powers were the US and the Soviets and the British, aka the Big Three. The war was the most brutal war of all time and would lead to the death of millions. The Axis side are often considered in the wrong, the Allies were often seen as in the right. The Germans, who started the war by annexing and invading nearby countries, were also the first to use bombing tactics in the invasion of Poland. The Germans eventually started to bomb the British, seeing as they were a major threat to the German war machine. The bombing started with the Battle of Britain, which took place in London and Coventry in 1940. In 1942, the British got their revenge on the Germans by bombing their cities. The German and the British would continue to bomb each other for the whole war. But in all that time, the Germans were bombed, Dresden was skipped. Near the end of 1944, the war started to appear to be leaning toward an Allied win. The Germans were being attacked by the Russians from the east, with the Germans' loss at the Battle of the Bulge. That was the last final offense on the Western Front. It was almost certain that Germany would fall. But the war was not over. The Allied countries were not over what the Germans have done. One individual who was not over the war was Arthur Travers Harris, who was Commander-in-Chief of the RAF Bomber Command. Arthur Harris was a notable figure of the British military and was instrumental in the bombing of Dresden. Arthur Harris was a World War I veteran and had served in South Africa, Iraq, India, and Britain. Harris climbed up the ranks all the way to Commander-in-Chief of the RAF Bomber Command in February of 1942. Harris was a firm believer in area bombing and perfected it for city bombing. His technique was known as saturation bombing. The saturation bombing technique was a form of mass bombing where instead of targeting military equipment, factories, railways, military bases, they would bomb civilian infrastructure and housing. The point of this technique was to destroy the enemy's will and ability to continue fighting so that the enemy would surrender. What's the point of fighting if everything you were protecting was destroyed? The use of this brutal tactic would lead to the nickname from the soldiers, Bomber Harris. Sir Norman Bottomley, who was deputy chief of the air staff, requested that Arthur Harris attack Berlin, Dresden, Leipzig, and Chemnitz as soon as possible. On the same day, Winston Churchill inquired about the bombing of the large cities in East Germany. The response that he received from the air staff said that instead of bombing the approved targets, they would instead attack cities in hopes of destroying communication. There were no objections to this response. Many believe that Winston Churchill bombed Dresden out of revenge for the Germans bombing Britain, but it was never acknowledged. From February 4th to the 11th of 1945, the three big allies met at the Yalta Conference to discuss how to finish the war and what to do after the war. During the meeting, Stalin, the leader of the USSR, requested that the Allies continue their bombing campaigns to help the Russians advance. 3 days after Yalta, the city of Dresden would be bombed. In Dresden, refugees were pouring in from the east, the Germans telling horror stories of what Red Army did to the German civilians, which caused people to flee west. Because of this, we do not know the exact number of people in Dresden, but we do know that the city had a population of 350,000. Dresden held some Allied POWs, so people took refuge knowing that the Allies would never bomb a city with their own people and with no real military significance. At least, they thought Dresden was safe.
13th February at dusk, RAF Lancasters wing their way toward Dresden in a massive blow involving more than 800 heavy bombers.
The bombing of Dresden began on February 13, 1945. The official reasoning for this attack was to destroy communication. The bombing began late at night when bombers descended on the peaceful city of Dresden. The bombing of Dresden continued for 3 days and was carried out in 2 waves. 800 bombers dropped some 2,700 tons of explosive and incendiaries in just the first day. The British dropped bombs indiscriminately over the city and destroyed 50% of civilian infrastructure and 23% of industrial infrastructure. The military defenses were so weak that only 6 Allied bombers were shot down. Most of the German soldiers and equipment were guarding Berlin, so the defense was very minimal in Dresden. The incendiary bombs dropped on Dresden created a firestorm that destroyed anything or anyone it touched. Most of the victims of the bombing of Dresden were women, children, and the elderly. The fire peaked at 1,500 Celsius and was a self-sustaining inferno. The air above Dresden was extremely hot, and the cold air on the ground was sucked into the fire, causing strong winds which often sucked people into the flames. When survivors tried to run, their feet were burned on the hot street. An eyewitness account by Lothar Metziger, recorded in Berlin in 1999, said that the streets were filled with burning vehicles, with refugees, people, horses screaming and shouting in pain and fear. Metzger recalled seeing adults shrink to the size of small children and pieces of body parts and dead people strewn across the ground. The quote says, "I cannot forget these terrible details. I can never forget them." The death toll is estimated to be 22,700 to 25,000 deaths, though some estimates go as high as 250,000. After the bombing of Dresden, more than 2,800 tons of bombs were dropped on Dresden until the end of the war. Most of the bodies were buried within days of the bombing raids. Immediately after the bombing of Dresden, the Germans used the bombing for propaganda, which was quite effective as it got attention of neutral countries and even reached the British House of Commons. German propaganda referred to the bombing of Dresden as the Dresden Massacre of Refugees. The Germans also inflated the death toll to 200,000 deaths. The Germans' political response indicated that the Germans were thinking about ditching the Geneva Convention on the Western Front. The British, after seeing the destruction of the bombs, ended up moving away from saturation bombing, saying that the Germans sustained enough bombing. The bombing of Dresden left the city nearly destroyed, and the Germans seriously thought of leveling it to rebuild it. Many German cultural sites were destroyed, but they decided to rebuild around Old Dresden with New Dresden, It was not until the 1990s when they decided to rebuild the center of Dresden. There had been many attempts of reconciliation for the bombing of Dresden. Queen Elizabeth II hosted a concert in Berlin for reconstruction of the Dresden Cathedral Frankenkirchen in 2004. In 2005, Alan Smith, who was the son of one of the bombers, made a metal cross that was recovered from nails from the roof of the Coventry Cathedral and was later presented to the Lutheran Bishop of Saxony. The bombing of Dresden was a significant event of World War II. It teaches us that the good guys are not always right. To me, it is blatantly obvious that the attack of Dresden was not for strategic advantage, but for revenge. Ask yourself, would Germany win if the Allies did not attack Dresden? We can compare it to even Iraq and Afghanistan. Was the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan worth it for the amount of American, Canadian, and Middle Eastern lives lost? We see that in war, sometimes it does not come down to normal morality. In war, there seems to be a different mentality that is simply related to human nature. Humans naturally want to take and or destroy something from someone who hurt us. We saw it in the response to the 9/11 attacks, and we saw it in 2020 when George Floyd was killed by a police officer. People will call for revenge, whether that is starting a war, disbanding the police, or the destruction of a civilian city. However, this is not how God created us to be. God created us to forgive and love each other, even when someone does something horrible to us. Ephesians 4:32 says, "Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as Christ, God, forgave you." We must strive to forgive each other even when it's hard, because the cycle of hate will just repeat itself all over again. And if we don't forgive, history will just repeat itself.